Long-running public sector strikes settled, race riots quashed, an uplift in the minimum wage, NHS waiting lists cut, NHS England scrapped, breakfast clubs introduced in schools, 100,000 extra kids entitled to free school meals, renationalisation of the railways, the establishment of GB Energy, British Steel saved, record numbers of immigrants deported, inflation down, interest rates falling, a trade deal with India, a trade deal with the United States, a trade reset with the European Union, Britain's reputation on the world stage restored, the unveiling of an industrial strategy, and the launch of a trade strategy. Oh, if you'd told Keir Starmer that his government would achieve all of this in its first year, I'm sure he'd have been delighted. However, his personal ratings have tumbled, as have that of the Labour Party. Do we have a government that is good at getting things done, but bad at politics? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Well, I have to catch my breath after listing all of those things that have been delivered by the Labour government as it comes up to celebrating its first anniversary on Friday of this week. But of course, for context, we've also had Giftgate, if we remember back to the free specs, the free suits and the free concert tickets. We've had far more damaging the winter fuel allowance. We had an unnecessary cabinet sacking in that of Lou Haig, in my opinion. And of course, we had the U-turn on grooming gangs and the very damaging, as far as business was concerned, increase to national insurance rates. So the context of Labour delivering all of those things that I listed in the introduction is that politically it's found itself struggling to come up with a narrative, a story, and we've talked about that often on this podcast. And in addition to that, they've had, it seems to me, an unfortunate relationship, if I may put it that way, with the Parliamentary Labour Party as the cabinet and the leadership, which has come to a head this week over an almighty row in terms of welfare reforms that the government are trying to push through. So to discuss today that first 12 months in office, we have, of course, the lovely, the wonderful, fresh from her morning swim, Jo Phillips, and finally, his battery is recharged after a fortnight of being plugged in, our AI hologram that is the wonderful Jim Hancock, who, of course, is 789 years of age. So welcome, both of you, to the Downtown Den Politics podcast this morning. And James, we have missed you over the past fortnight, although Kevin Johnson was a very, very able substitute, as you can imagine. Let me first of all start off asking you for your reflections on that first year of Keir Starmer's government.
Well, you very comprehensively put the two things in the scales. I was going to begin what I'm going to say with that positive list, because I think we need to be fair. The foundations have been laid potentially for long-term investment, which will perhaps not even in this parliament, but in subsequent parliaments, prove really important in terms of green energy, nuclear investment, that sort of thing. The government have to be given credit for that, and for beginning to bring waiting lists down, and for raising the minimum wage, as there are more wages in people's pockets. But the trouble is, as we've frequently discussed before, it's all drowned out by these mistakes that have been made, and they've really reached serious proportions in the since I last spoke to you about 3 weeks ago, because this, I know we'll probably go on to discuss it in more detail later on, but this huge black hole that's now, to coin a phrase, been created because of, and I'm going to be very tough on the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, because one's hearing at the weekend calls for her to go. And the reason I'm going to be tough on her is because everybody's agreed. I think the parliamentary party was agreed on welfare reform, but Rachel Reeves moved into that process to extract money, and it's because of that that's really annoyed the backbenchers, and so serious misjudgments on that front. The messaging has not just been bad to the parliamentary party, but it's been to the country, and if there's got to be one big change, it's got to be that. Sometimes governments get off to a bad start. There's no doubt that with a volatile American president and a volatile global situation, the Prime Minister has had to be distracted. I'll be interested in your views on his sort of mea culpa interview in The Observer yesterday, where I was quite surprised that he said hiring Sue Gray was a mistake. I mean, that was real chest-beating stuff. And will people give him credit for admitting his mistakes, or say, well, that's all very well, but you made the mistakes in the first place? So a pretty rocky first year. There's no challenge from the Conservative Party, but there's the electoral price they're paying is the rise of the right, and so a tricky first year. Still 4 years to go. Week in politics a long time, so let's not panic yet. But it is interesting, the position of the Chancellor. I may be exaggerating it, and I'll be interested in what you have to say. But these are serious errors, and her credibility is on the line now. That they both of them now have this thought in backbenchers' minds that they can be pushed around. And one last thought: why has there been this huge surge of rebellion by the backbenchers? One interesting theory I heard at the weekend was that an awful lot of them know they are one-term MPs, and they might as well display their Labour zeal, if you like, what the Labour Party's all about, because they ain't going to be there after 2029.
Thanks, James. Joe, your thoughts on that first year of the Labour government, perhaps picking up on one or two things Jim said, but we will get into the personalities, the Sue Grays, the Morgan McSweeneys, and indeed the Rachel Reeveses a little later in the conversation. So your overall thoughts of the government's performance?
My overall thoughts are disappointing. And I think, for all the things that you and Jim have just outlined, yes, they have done things, but nobody feels them, nobody sees them, nobody talks about them. And part of that is an extremely hostile press. I mean, more than I've ever seen, I think, in all the years I've been doing politics. So that makes it difficult anyway. But one of the things that struck me, I was doing an interview last week, and Neil Duncan Jordan, who's a Labour MP, he has never met the Prime Minister. Now, I find that absolutely staggering, and that was just a tiny little snapshot. Do you not meet all your MPs, even to shake their hand and say hello, or have them in batches for a cup of tea or a drink or whatever it is? And it's this detachment of, the management, which is Starmer and Reeves, neither of whom have got a political bone in their body, and the rest of the Parliamentary Labour Party, the Labour Party, people who voted Labour because they thought they were better than the last lot, and the public at large. And it's that disconnect that is so very, very damaging. Most of the mistakes are entirely of their own making, and it doesn't matter how many times you say, oh, I got it wrong, I'm sorry. Actually, you shouldn't have got it wrong in the first place. Winter fuel will be round their necks like an albatross forever and ever and ever, just like tuition fees were for the Liberal Democrats, and it took them years to recover from that broken promise. And I think, there's one good thing, I think, and I think Jim's point is right, or yours, Frank, I can't remember who said it, but, yes, the Labour Parliamentary Party have found their they found their balls, if you like, and they've suddenly thought, hang on a minute, I'm here for a reason. And good for them, because they've stood up. And what has come out clear and loud is that the government were never listening to the concerns of the MPs. They weren't engaging with disability and poverty campaign groups in the same way as we heard that they didn't engage with the farming community on inheritance tax and so on and so forth. If you don't engage with your MPs, then you are not engaging with their constituents. If you're not doing that, you are not engaging with the public. So all you're doing is being a manager in a not very good organisation. And yes, of course, there are lots of external factors that have made things horrific and hard. And there is no doubt that he is knackered and he's been away and he's been on the world stage too much. But he's got good people around him that he doesn't use. Rachel Reeves, I'm afraid, is toast. And I think you've got two people at the top of the government who haven't got any political nous, any common sense, and nobody is managing the comms.
We've said that since almost week one, haven't we, in terms of the comms
absolutely.
and the lack of a story that we've long bemoaned. But let me just push back a little on the question of Labour MPs. I totally understand and appreciate that the welfare reforms have been a bit of a mess in terms of the way they've been presented. The thing that's frustrating me about the rebels is that they're not really coming up with an alternative to how we start to sort out this huge mess that we've gotten ourselves into in respect of sickness benefits. And quite simply, anecdotal evidence, but strong anecdotal evidence, that people now are going online, seeing what questions they're going to be asked down the phone, answering those questions correctly, and up to 65% of them, on the basis of that telephone interview, are then being given very generous sickness benefits through PIPs, personal independent programs. That is costing fortunes, £100 billion, the last estimate, and our overall welfare bill is £390 billion. So the fact of the matter is, whether the Parliamentary Labour Party or 150 of them like it or not, we are going to have to tackle that particular problem. And it's okay them hiding behind this excuse that Rachel Reeves has drank the Treasury Kool-Aid, both on winter fuel allowance and on these welfare reforms. And I think that to an extent there is some degree of truth in that. But nevertheless, the frustrating thing for me is that none of them are saying, here is the alternative plan. And what Labour is for is work, not sickness benefits, not welfare, it's work. It's giving people, as Tony Blair coined the phrase, a hand up rather than a handout. And if those MPs were coming forward with an alternative plan that helped to do that, then I'd have far more sympathy. In terms of the relationship with the Prime Minister and Keir Starmer's inability to forge close relationships with those MPs, and I'm with you, Joe, I absolutely agree, to organise a reception or two to make sure that you meet all of your members of Parliament, the people that you are relying on to support you through these tough times, and there's inevitably going to be tough times given the inheritance the government have. That ought to have been done. However, I've got less sympathy with those people who say, we never see Keir in the tea room. He doesn't put an arm around us. He doesn't kiss and cuddle us. Here is a Prime Minister who has had an absolutely horrendous baptism of fire as far as the geopolitical agenda is concerned. We've again said this year, there is no time in our lives that we can remember a more worrying, concerning global political environment. And so inevitably, and quite rightly in my opinion, the Prime Minister is taking a lead role in trying to calm things down, trying to act as a bit of a bridge between Donald Trump and Europe, trying to say the right things in this very, very sensitive issue of Gaza and Israel. And we continue to get Labour MPs saying, well, he's never here. He never gives me a cuddle. Fucking grow up and actually understand and appreciate the tough job that Keir Starmer has had to inherit. Now, as I say, no excuse for not organising a couple of receptions and saying hiya to the MPs, but this idea that he should be in the tea rooms, glad handing them all every week, I think is nonsensical. The final point I'll make, though, and this comes back, I think, to the overarching problem that the government has had, and it's been put into a microcosm this week in terms of what's happened. So they've launched an industrial strategy, which is, say to people who are listening to the podcast today, have a read of it. It's well thought through. It's not just well intentioned. There's some real chance of delivery on some of those key strategic objectives that's been set in that industrial strategy, and then a trade strategy which absolutely pivots towards doing more deals with the European Union and accepting that that's where our future lies. Overshadowed those two great pieces of work, which I'm sure have taken the full 12 months to work through, totally overshadowed by this row, unnecessary row, as you say, Joe, shot themselves in the foot over welfare reform. And isn't that the story of this government? So all of those things that I listed, Joe, at the start of this podcast have been overshadowed by these stupid mistakes. And as you rightly say, you can say once, sorry, you might get away with it twice, but when it comes to, well, this is the 99th sorry, people just stop listening, don't they?
Yeah, and I just would say that, you're absolutely right. And I don't, MPs who think that the Keir Starmer should be sitting next to them every 5 minutes, it's pathetic, it's ridiculous. But there is a way of communicating, there's a way of feeling that Downing Street is connecting with you. It doesn't have to be the Prime Minister himself, but you have your lieutenants, you have your whips, you have other people there. So there's that. The other thing, and I think you're absolutely right, Frank, is yes, come up with an alternative, because the welfare bill is unsustainable. So what you need to do, as many people have said, is you stop the telephone interviews. You bring back face-to-face interviews, and that is a huge deterrent for many people. And then, of course, if there are people who really can't get to face-to-face, then you adjust accordingly. But if you come in and say, right, we are going to reform it, instead of we need to do this to save money, it's all about the language. It's all about
messaging again, Joe.
Yes. And it's not that difficult. Everybody thinks it's ridiculous. But if you end up having the story that is, you're going to, take money away from disabled people so they won't be able to go to work. No, actually, what you're doing is tightening up the rules. So you've got to turn up in person. You've got to go through the interview process. You're not going to be able to get your mate to fill the form in, and so on and so forth. It's really simple. And if they'd done that, this is about reform. And the other thing that you didn't mention very briefly in your list of achievements, the one that I think is absolutely fantastic is what Shabana Mahmood is doing in the Justice Department. They have got really good people. They've got David Gauke, former Tory minister. They've got James Timpson now in the Lords. They're really working at transforming the judicial system, the penal system. And I even heard Alex Chalk, the former Tory Lord Chancellor, on the radio the other day saying, what they're doing is what he proposed, and he's really happy to talk to them. And that gets no coverage because it's not interesting. But they're allowing themselves to be, they're not telling the story. And that is rule number one of comms. What's the story that you want to tell?
I think that's been the biggest problem, Jim, isn't it? They seem to be a government that reacts rather than sets the agenda. They're not proactive enough. They don't get the story right, not just in terms of the media comms, but as Joe has outlined there, with their own colleagues, with those backbench MPs. So welfare reform, and I think you made the point, general consensus across Parliament, actually, that this is an issue that we need to get a grip of. But it's been sold as, let's fire £5 billion to help Rachel get out of a straitjacket in terms of the fiscal rules that she's set herself. And in those circumstances, when you're talking to Labour MPs, and I've spoken to many of them over the past couple of weeks on this particular issue, you are fighting against that battle of somebody who knows that welfare needs to be reformed, but equally has been given an excuse not to vote for this particular set of measures. And as we've said previously, in the context of other people in this country, once you start to get to live to a particular level of income, then it's very difficult when you drop. So the compromise that has happened belatedly in terms of saying, OK, people who are on PIPs at this moment in time, they're allowed to keep them. Moving forward, we're going to be more sophisticated, if I may put it that way, in terms of how we measure who is eligible and who isn't. Why wasn't that done 3 or 4 months ago? Because again, I go back to comments we made on this very podcast when it was first mooted that these changes were going to take place. As former welfare rights advisor, I said that's all very well. The consultation has got to be spot on. Seems to me they've not really consulted, Jim. And again, that storytelling, that communication has been poor.
Yeah, I mean, I think with some of these strategies, I mean, obviously the government had to come in and actually look at the books. I understand that. But I would have thought, and this is one of the, going back to our general critique of Labour's first year in office, is this lack of preparedness, 14 years in opposition. You know, they could have done the substantial work on all these infrastructure reviews and the health service reviews and things, and then, you know, attached the financial parameters to it after they came into office and got on with it. They've wasted a year. I think on the welfare reform, of course, and we're like a broken record here. They're trying to do this without the elephant in the room, which the Liberal Democrats keep on hammering on about, and rightly so. This welfare reform doesn't have that overall structure to it, that overall feeling of bringing people together, consulting them and coming forward with it, because social care has been kicked down the road. So whatever these welfare reforms are, they won't be part of the comprehensive look at how we look after people who are in need of benefits during their working lives, young children who are exploited or in poverty, and elderly people facing horrendous care costs. The thing needs to be looked at in its totality, as you say, Frank, with full consultation. But I do make the observation that, I mean, we already discussed when the winter fuel allowance thing happened. One of the consequences of that, in my opinion, is going to be that no political party, probably not even Reform UK, are going to touch the triple lock because they see the sensitivity of this now. So, but I also think it's interesting because we sort of think that, I mean, Starmer may have had sort of a socialist background and all this work with Corbyn and things like that. But in some ways, there seems quite a radical underpinning of the Parliamentary Labour Party. And I don't think they've got it, their heart's not in welfare reform because they see it as so central to the delivery of a rather old, to some extent, old-fashioned Labour project. So I'm very pessimistic as to whether we're going to see this. What I think we're likely to see is more of the same, trying to, the ministers trying to inch forward, being knocked back by the Parliamentary Party, and it's going to be a little bit of a shambles. I just wanted to invite Joe to, Joe says there's plenty of good people around Sir Keir able to sort of help him with this, because Frank's point's well made. He can't be in the tea room all the time. I'm just would gently say, who are these people? Because James Lyons was brought in to be the new communications guy after the Sue Gray crisis. He's been virtually invisible, and he certainly hasn't delivered in terms of good communications. I'm not sure that there are enough good people. I mean, just to finish off with, you're talking about what's going on in the Justice Department. Mr. Gawke, Mr. Timpson, both Conservatives actually in their background, so they seem to be able to make a fist of it. Labour don't seem to be very well powered up with good people.
Well, I think there are good people around. I think, we have to ask the question, and I don't suppose any of us know, is Morgan McSweeney the new Sue Gray? And, they are always, whoever is there, whether it's Alistair Campbell or Charlie Whelan or back in the day, Bernard Ingham or Dominic Cummings or whoever it is, they become the lightning rod because they are seen as the person who stops Downing Street having any connection with the outside world. And it may be that Morgan McSweeney is unfairly judged. But I think, there are people who spring to mind, like Paul Waugh, for instance, who you will know, who eventually won Rochdale back from George Galloway, remember him. But Paul Waugh was the political editor of The Eye. Now, he's a really articulate, intelligent, Rochdale lad, born and bred. Use people like that, pick a few people. They don't have to be front benchers. They can just be sensible people who actually understand it, get it, will have conversations. I've already mentioned Shabana Mahmood. I think she's very good. I think Louise Hay has got a lot going for her, and she's on the back benches now. She might not be preaching the message that Keir Starmer wants out there, but she's a good conduit. But I do think, I think that's interesting what you've said, that, is Keir Starmer trying to actually move the Labour Party away and forward to a much more resilient country, a much more self-reliant country, in a way more in the mold of Tony Blair, when some of the people actually want to go back to, maybe not Corbyn, but a sort of a welfare state, heavy trade unions and all of those things. And
I mean, they really resent the defence spend. I've had disparaging remarks that backbenchers have made about the defence spending.
But
I
Jim,
mean, they need
again,
to smell the coffee.
But again, it comes down to how you tell the story. If the story is you're cutting foreign aid in order to spend it on arms, maybe some of them will go to Israel, who knows? Look at John Major's fantastic speech that he made at the weekend, where he talked about how, the language of politics has become so self-interested that we've lost our humanity. We now accept appalling language, appalling behaviour, but we've lost our humanity and our kindness. How can it be right to cut aid? He didn't say for defence, but Labour has allowed the story to be, we're cutting aid, we're spending it on bombs. We're cutting winter fuel, we're spending it on, defence. They haven't got the story straight. Instead of saying this is about reform, this is about making our country stronger and more resilient. And with that goes not just defence and security. It means a healthier, more able, more resilient country. All of those things which tie into the health service reforms, mental health reforms, and welfare reforms. But they're not telling the story. They're not owning it.
I think the story that they'd like to tell, and I guess Starmer would say he's tried to tell, is that this is a 10-year project and they are going to try in this first parliament to put the foundations in place in which they can then begin to build what would be described as a more social democratic country. I think that the problem he's got is that A, he's not been able to tell that story effectively. B, I think the geopolitical environment is worse than it was even 12 months ago. Now, some may say, well, you could have predicted that, but I'm not sure we could. And thirdly, and I think this is his biggest problem, is that both he and perhaps Morgan McSweeney to an extent have got this approach where it's their way or the highway. They don't seem to me to be great listeners, and part of communication is listening. It's not just about telling people what you want to do, it's listening to people as well. And what they potentially underestimated is that the new intake of MPs, you haven't necessarily got those people who've got the experience or the balls actually to ride out difficult and challenging times. They're looking at those opinion polls a year in, and as Jim said, thinking, well, we're only going to be here for one term anyway, so we may as well just be disruptive and go for the easy options and not get stick in my constituency postbag or in my constituency surgeries. Well, again, I'd have to say to those Labour MPs, you were in opposition for 14 years for a reason. You were in opposition for 14 years because you were seen as soft on welfare. You were seen as soft on immigration. You were seen as soft in terms of defending the country. So if you want to go back into opposition for another 14 years, I have to say, I think some of them are more comfortable in opposition than they are in government, sadly, then you continue to kick back at all these difficult and challenging things that the government are having to do. And as much as I would absolutely agree with the commentary that both made in terms of the government not getting ahead of the curve in terms of some of these stories, in terms of being slow to make the politically intuitive decision, grooming gangs falls into that category for sure. And then perhaps surrounding yourself with people who, given the fact that you're both, in terms of Starmer and Reeves, quite technocratic in your approach, surround yourselves with people who are better at the politics. My suggestion last week, for example, bring Andy Burnham into the tent. So it's those sort of things that perhaps they can get better in year 2. But I tell you, with this big intake, it seems to me, of soft left Labour MPs, soft being the operative word in this particular instance, then my advice to Morgan McSweeney would be, get your bloody shin pads on, take your baseball bat out and go and have a serious word with them and explain to them the facts of life, what you've actually inherited. And if they think they're one-term MPs, then I'll tell you what, they're going the right way about making that particular scenario come true with these off-the-record briefings to the press, these rebellions, signing all sorts of early day notices. I've never seen a majority of this size disintegrate as quickly, Jim.
Well, yes. I mean, if you think about, for instance, Margaret Thatcher's first term, she was very unpopular by 1981, didn't have a huge majority, but there wasn't a disintegration. There was, a sticking behind her in that respect.
Maybe, Jim, the majority's too big. Francis Pym once famously said. Didn't get thanked for it by his boss, Margaret Thatcher, at the time. Landslides are not great for governments, and I think we could put the current melee that the government is going through into that category too.
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, a lot of these MPs know they won't be in the next parliament, and also a lot of them know that even if they do a great job of loyalty and so on, they're not going to be ministers. And so those incentives are gone. Just to reflect on some of the interesting things that you guys have said. I mean, you're quite right when you said, Frank, the government couldn't have envisaged the global situation being as it is. Absolutely right, because until November, Kamala Harris could have been president of the United States. Think of the different dynamics, the easier global situation. I mean, it would have been difficulties and so on, but in terms of what Starmer had to deal with, if he was dealing with Kamala Harris, that would have been a big difference. Just to emphasize how right you are about the practical things about welfare reform. I mean, the idea that you don't have to see somebody to be assessed, that's really important. Though, of course, the civil servants or the GPs, they're going to roll in this. They've got to have their heart in it to be tough. And I don't underestimate the difficulty when you've got someone in front of you who says they're mentally ill or something, to actually say, well, I don't agree with you, and send them out of the surgery without going on to benefits. That has to be thought about, because that's the cutting edge of this. Some people have got to be told some hard truths, in inverted commas. Just on the last thing, I mean, I'm holding my breath, right? This Morgan McSweeney should get tough with them. I mean, that's a high risk strategy, because for all the reasons that we've said about the backbench MPs not having a longer term stake in being in Parliament, if you actually provoke that, you could risk a sort of more or less a sort of civil war spectacle. But you obviously think that they would listen to that. I don't know.
Well, I just think, Jim, at the end of the day, you need to be honest with the electorate, but you have to be honest with your own backbenchers as well. And to suggest that you can come in and be a tax and spend government when the country is being taxed more than it's ever been taxed before, when we've already seen the negative impact of the tax increases that Rachel Reeves has tried to introduce. You see, she would say to that soft left element, what more do you want me to do? I've just upped our tax levels and I've hammered business with national insurance. Where else do I go for the money? And the MPs will say to you, Jim, I'll tell you what those MPs would say, put a wealth tax on people. And I'll tell you what I'd say to that. You watch your treasury take drop to the ocean bloody seabed, because when you get to the tipping point, which is about 45 pence of tax, then people start to run to the hills. They'll put the money in trusts. They'll put it offshore. Even people from the SME sector will start to find ways of not paying that tax to the Treasury because they say it's unfair. So at some point, we need to have an honest conversation, yes, with the electors of this country, but also with those soft left MPs who think that, or thought perhaps that it was all going to be milk and honey.
But there
What
are
world were they living in, Jim?
There are other tax options, and if they listen to the Liberal Democrats again, gambling tax, a tax on the media companies, which apparently they're frightened to do because they're all American based and Trump will be fed up. There are alternative ways of raising tax,
but not to the extent where you're going to find the billions of pounds needed to support a £380 billion annual welfare bill, a spiralling and spiking spend on the National Health Service, the money they want to see invested in education. All of these things are not, you don't touch the sides with those taxes that you've just mentioned. And you're saying they need to sort out social care.
A penny on income tax, then, would that cause the problems that you're concerned about? What about what they should have done? I think we're agreed in the first place. They should have said at the general election, we are a Labour Party, we've got these priorities, bang, 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 and we are going to put it up by a penny, and they would have still got into office.
Jim, they get absolutely hammered, Jim.
They would get completely hammered because they promised not to. You might get away with it if you did a hypothecated tax, which the Lib Dems did, back in my day, which was a penny for education. And I think Jim's absolutely right. There are ways of corporate taxation, particularly on global companies like Amazon and all the others. You can look at that more imaginatively. But again, it goes back to this thing that if you say, right, we've got to cut this welfare bill, and at the same time, we're doing this. So we're going to stop phone appointments. We bring back the face-to-face that went out of the window during COVID. We're going to do more corporation tax and look at taxing other things. But, you look at something like, for instance, the transport bill for local authorities to send children in private taxis, children with special needs, special educational needs, is going through the roof, as are the numbers of children who are diagnosed with special educational needs. And you don't have to be brutally unkind to ask the question, where is that coming from? It's a little bit like, the mental health issues that put many people on disability benefits. There is a point when you have to have a conversation, but if you are under pressure, if you're working in a benefits office, and you'll know this, Frank, because you did it, and your pressure is to get through, resolve this, move on to the next one, instead of saying, no, you've got to come into the office, Mr. McKenna, sorry, we need to see you face to face. Thank you. Then on to the next one. If you change that, you change the fundamental thing and you change people's attitudes. But if you go, oh, little Johnny needs extra attention at school, so therefore he's now got to have a taxi picking him up from home and driving him halfway across the county to a special school because there aren't any teaching assistants, there is something fundamentally wrong.
There's no naughty kids anymore. They're all AD something or OB something or whatever it might be. And before people start fucking writing to me or emailing me, my eldest, one of my daughters, not the eldest, one of my daughters has got one of those conditions that are considered to be special needs, but she's fine and she's never been to special educational needs school and she's great and she's flying now. So it doesn't always have to be, Joe. You're absolutely right. Anyway, take the personal out of this. Let me get back to the politics. And I don't think taxes where they can go in terms of raising income tax, Jim. But what I would say to you is that on day one of the new government, they could have had an emergency debate in the Commons. Rachel Reeves could have said at that point, having looked under the bonnet, I've found a £22 billion black hole. We've also discovered that our defence spending is going to increase, because even at that point, we understood and appreciated that we would need to spend more money on defence. And there's a whole range of other issues here that we have to deal with. Maybe then she could have introduced a 1p income tax rise. I think the only option that she's got now is to actually go back to her fiscal rules and see if the markets will buy a story that says, we've now done a deal with NATO, and we'll discuss this in more detail tomorrow in our podcast then, that is going to see our increase in terms of GDP to 5% of defence spending. And therefore, I'm going to set aside a borrowing amount that will simply pay for that spending. That, for me, seems to be the only wriggle room she has. I don't think the tax increases that either of you mentioned, as I say, touches the sides in terms of you would need to get to. And again, where I'd be wholly sympathetic with you in terms of let's go and tax all these media companies and tech firms, well, that's fine. But get ready for a 25 to 50% tariff being slapped on some of your goods by our mate Donald, because they're all his friends, right? So you've got that potentially that political challenge as well. Let's move on to the personalities, though, because I do want to get your thoughts on Rachel Reeves and her chances of survival. As you said, Jim, very, very unpopular on the backbenchers. But you will know better than I, because of your historic experience in terms of our politics. I was trying to think of this morning, and I can't think of a prime minister who has rid himself of a chancellor and then survived themselves for much longer afterwards. You may tell me differently.
Oh, I'd love to research that and come back to.
Oh, you put him on the spot, Frank.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
I'm just going through, Thatcher fell out with Lawson and that.
And then Geoffrey
That was
Howe.
later on, yeah.
And Geoffrey, but it was never the same afterwards, was it? That government always struggled more so after that fallout. Then,
well, I mean,
Blair would never sack Brown.
Well, exactly.
Brown didn't sack Darling after the financial crash. Truss got rid of Kwarteng, and then she got done in herself. Johnson did for Sajid Javid, and then Sunak eventually ended up taking over from Johnson, although Truss was in between. You know what I'm saying? I can't think of any modern time. Go on, sorry, you thought on. Oh, right, there you go.
The night of the long knives, Harold Macmillan was in trouble, and he sacked Selwyn Lloyd as his chancellor. I'm pretty certain about that.
Well, he laid down
that created the famous phrase, he laid down his friends for his life.
Didn't he lose the next election?
Yeah, then.
Well, he retired ill about a couple of years later.
Well, he didn't survive then, did he? I mean, if Starmer, I'm not suggesting that if Starmer reshuffled Rachel Reeves, that he wouldn't survive as leader until the next election. But whether he'd win the next election is the big question, because I just think those two are almost joined at the hip. I don't know.
You're right. You're right to the extent that once, I mean, it's a very serious matter to sack your chancellor, because you are then exposed. You can't really do it twice. I mean, there's a book's been written about how Tony Blair actually, in 2001, after having the first term re-elected with another huge majority, he should have sacked Brown then, because, I mean, I continue to reflect on the debilitating effect that a quite unnecessary row between two highly talented men spoiled, to some extent, distracted that whole New Labour project. I mean, obviously the danger was Brown would have gone away and formed a cell
to finish the government, Jim.
Well, okay. Well, it's very difficult. Anyway, I'm going to do some more research on this, but I'm coming up with Selwyn Lloyd in 1961. Macmillan didn't recover. Yeah, okay. Someone who stayed in office. Oh, Attlee. I mean, Stafford Cripps. Well, no, he had to resign because of a leak. Yeah, okay. I'll work on it. I'll be back next week.
Let's see if I can get a more considered approach from you, Joe, in terms of that particular question, and also your thoughts on Morgan McSweeney, who again is being seen by some as the problem.
I think I don't see the bond between Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer in the same way as it was between Blair and Brown. My old boss, Bob Geldof, used to say they were the Lennon and McCartney of politics. And actually, I think in the beginning that was true. I think Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are, they are from the same managerial cloth, if you like.
Too similar.
Too similar. And what you need is a yin and a yang. And you know what you haven't got is any warmth from either of them. And I think that is one of the things that is really lacking. And one of the reasons, you know, that people like Nigel Farage do well is they appear to be human. Angela Rayner, for all her many faults, is human. You know, Mel Stride, Jim's favourite, can be human. But the two of them, Reeves and Starmer, don't seem to be human. They don't seem to be living in the real world of real people. Morgan McSweeney, I don't know. I did used to work with his wife before she became an MP. He is apparently very driven and very focused. But, you know, Keir Starmer has had, in opposition, he had Deborah Mattinson as his advisor. He wouldn't open his mouth without going through a focus group, even though people were saying, hang on a minute, just sit on the bus or listen to a phone in, see what people, you know, all of us know exactly how easy it is to test the measure of what people are talking about. You just go out on the street, you go to the pub, you go to the football, you listen to the radio, whatever. And I think Keir Starmer is very cautious. He wants to have everything weighed up in front of him. And that way is good for some things, but you lose time. And during that time, there's a vacuum which gets filled by nonsense and mischief. Rachel Reeves doesn't seem to have any sort of social nuance, if you like. And, you know, she's got it wrong too on the freebies, the free tickets to concerts and things like that at the same time as cutting winter fuel. You know, they don't seem to have any bloody common sense. And actually, you know, when you look at people like, you know, Heidi Alexander, she's human. You know, she speaks human. She's, you know, somebody you could relate to. Jackie Smith, you know, I know she's in the Lords, but again, somebody that is relatable. And I think the problem is that, as you rightly say, if you get rid of your Chancellor, you're absolutely naked. But you can move things around and you can bring in other people to be much more at the forefront. You know, who do we ever hear from, apart from whoever's on the morning round duty? Wes Streeting. So you put up your main opposition who wants to get your job as your main spokesperson, and everybody else just fades into insignificance, apart from people like Andy Burnham. You know, Andy Burnham is human, for goodness sake. And I just think, you know, somebody needs to take Rachel Reeves out and say to her, go out, put on a wig and dark glasses or something, but just go and listen to people. Don't parrot what other people are telling you. Just sit on a bus and go around London for a bit and just listen to what people are talking about. And Morgan McSweeney, you know, he is like many of these people, he may well be brilliant, but as yet we've got to see it. But, you know, when you are so driven with a goal, that's fine. But you need to look at the injuries you leave on the way and the, you know, the malevolence and the opprobrium that builds up. You know, Anthony Seldon always says being a good leader is about being on the bridge of a ship, not in getting involved in the barroom brawls and the, you know, the engine room and all the rest. But you need to have really good people in those places. And I'm not sure that Keir Starmer, with Morgan McSweeney as his lieutenant, has got either of those things, because what you need is somebody who will go down and say, hang on a minute, come on, let's sort this out. Okay. You know, if you look at
let's try and get to the end of this, because I'm conscious of the time. We've been nearly at this an hour now. I mean, my penny's worth. I don't think either Rachel Reeves or Morgan McSweeney should be dispensed with at this moment in time. I think that they've all being culpable of mistakes, but equally let's learn from the mistakes. And one of the big criticisms I would make of the government, both in terms of the leadership and those parliamentary Labour Party backbenchers, is inexperience. And you only get experience from staying in the job at learning. I would say to Rachel, stop listening just to the Treasury advice and listen to some of your colleagues and some of your advisors as well, who are probably far more politically attuned than those Treasury officials who are just trying to save a few bob. And I would also say, because I've met them both on numerous occasions, Keir and Rachel are very human on a one-to-one level, And it's just a pity that they're not able to project that onto the media. And Gordon Brown had that problem as well, let's not forget. So that's not the worst thing in the world. But equally, as you say, Joe, sometimes when you've got that as a weakness, then you have to find people with the alternative strength. Going back to your comment about Wes Streeting, he did the media rounds yesterday. He was absolutely outstanding and dealt with the question that Angela Rayner failed to deal with, in my opinion, in a convincing way. Are you going to ever challenge for the leadership of the Labour Party? And he just totally dismissed the question and moved on, a la Farage, like exactly the right way to handle that particular question, whereas Angela got herself into the point of saying, I'm never going to run for the leadership. Well, a stupid thing to say. Anyway, Jim, final word to you in terms of the personality of Reeves and McSweeney.
Yes, just to say that I've now done my research, and I think the serious answer to your question is most of the time prime ministers fall fairly soon after their chances. Macmillan in the 50s had Thornycroft, Amory and Lloyd, and survived for quite a long time after that. The outstanding one was Margaret Thatcher's decision to remove Geoffrey Howe and put in Nigel Lawson after 1983, because she obviously went on to a further triumph in 1987, and Lawson, you know, had a bit more of the vim to actually do the great Thatcher revolution. But enough of these historical reflections. I mean, obviously Morgan McSweeney would say, you know, that he's got the instincts to actually try and deliver this reform, sort of, and be aware of blue Labour and that sort of aspect of it. So I think he probably will stay, and you're for the reasons we've said, probably Starmer will stick with Rachel Reeves. Partly because there aren't a lot of obvious alternatives. I mean, that's not always a strong argument for not doing it. Though Pat McFadden, who's not everyone's cup of tea because he's sort of eminence grise, sort of Undertaker type personality, but obviously he's a clever man and could hold the office. And my favourite's always Johnny Reynolds, but I keep on saying that. But I think probably Frank's instinct is right that it would be a very serious thing, and just to bring this in, Labour having prominent women in position is an issue, and the first female chancellor, put her under the bus, not a great look.
Yeah, it's a great point, actually, Jim. I've not necessarily thought of that. And to replace her with Wes Streeting, which has been mooted by some, I think you get yourself into that problem as well. And the idea that Wes is going to go soft on welfare, it's for the birds, I'd have thought. He's ripping up the NHS in an absolutely correct fashion. But some would say not even going fast or far enough in that respect. But I think there'd be reluctance to move Wes Streeting from health because he is seen to be probably the star performer in terms of taking on a big job and delivering, notwithstanding what you've said about Mahmood at the Home Office, Joe, but a much smaller, obviously very direct job in terms of prison reform there. Before we close today's podcast, can I just ask you one final question, and that is marks out of 10 for Keir Starmer's first year in government. Joe?
I'll be kind and say 7.
Okay. James?
5.
Okay. Well, I'll be the Liberal Democrat this week and go for 6 out of 10. There you go. But I think we would all say, if we were writing a school report and doing a comment, then that comment would read, must do better. And I would say to Labour MPs, the thing that always used to be written on my school report, too easily distracted. Stick to the focus of the big issues that you were elected to do, which was to stabilise the country, to grow the economy, and, as it said on your manifestos and on all of your leaflets, change. And change means taking some very, very difficult decisions at this moment in time. Anyway, I'm sure that we will have more to discuss as far as the government's performance is concerned, not least that vote that takes place on those welfare reforms later this week. We will come back to that in next Monday's episode of the Downtown Den Politics podcast. We'll be back tomorrow, of course, to talk some domestic politics, but geopolitics mainly, with that NATO summit under the microscope and some of the things that our mate Donald has been up to in the United States as well. So join us again tomorrow. It's been great to have you on this Monday. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for listening.